Well, we start May today with Psalm 44, and this is a psalm about a unpleasant fact of every Christian life, which is suffering. John 16:33 makes it pretty clear that all Christians are going to suffer. Uh, Jesus says, "These things I have spoken to you," to the disciples, "so that in me you may have peace." Listen to this. In the world you will have tribulation, but take courage. I have overcome the world. In the world you will have tribulation. Isn't that the case? One reason we suffer is we live in a fallen world. We're subject to all the effects of fallenness, from drought and pestilence to storms and terribly hot days and terribly cold ones. Sometimes, we bring suffering on ourselves through our resistance to God, but other times, even the faithful suffer, which is what we see in this psalm. And we see the faithful suffering throughout the New Testament. Paul suffered. I like 2 Corinthians 12:7. He says, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations that he had received, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. This is Paul. Paul, the faithful disciple, the Paul that suffered so much in his ministry. Paul is sent suffering from the Lord in order to keep him humble. As I said, suffering is just part and parcel of being a Christian, and Philippians 1:29 says you've been granted for Christ's sake not only believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake. Sometimes, somehow, they don't tell you that part when they're offering the gospel, do they? That not only will you be saved, but you'll suffer. And that's the case of most Christians and most Christians in the world today. We also see suffering is used to bring about a greater good. Like think of Paul in Acts chapter 9, verse 16, where the Lord told him that he's going to be shown how much he must suffer for Christ's sake. So Paul's suffering was to reach a greater good, the proclamation of Christ around the world. We see it again in Philippians. Paul is working this out, living it out in his life in Philippians 1:12 through 14, where he tells the Philippians that his jailing, his being in jail and incarcerated turned out for the greater progress of the gospel. His imprisonment for Christ has been made known among the Caesar's Guard group, the Praetorian Guard, and to everyone else. And not only that, not only has the unbelievers been made known of Christ, but also the believers are encouraged and trusting in the Lord as they see Paul weathering his own imprisonment. I mentioned before in the other Psalms too how 2 Corinthians 1:3 and 4 tells us that our suffering helps us to help others in their suffering. It says this, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God." So, why do Christians suffer? Why do faithful Christians suffer? It's part of the Christian life. Sometimes it's suffering to bring about a greater good, equips us to help others. This psalm is about suffering. Psalm 44, as you read it today, the first 8 verses reflect on the past suffering. Again, remember, this is a maskil sort of psalm, a psalm of teaching, psalm of wisdom. Begins with a reflection, as most wisdom does. Reflection on the past and reflection on past suffering. And then in verses 9 to 22, it talks about the psalmist's present suffering. And if you recall, we see that as we moved into book 2 of the Psalms, that we are talking about Israel in exile, Israel being scattered, and then we'll see later regathered. Verses 23 through 26, then, we'll talk about the prospects, given the fact that they have suffered in the past and they're suffering now. Is this going to continue? And they turn to God in confidence and ask Him to notice their condition. So I think, just in terms of summary, I'll just summarize this since it's kind of a longer psalm. It reflects on God's past deliverances and the current troubles that are faced by His people. That's what it's doing here. And it praises God for His victories and His protection in the past, but also doesn't shy away from the fact that that the psalmist feels rejected and dishonored right now in their present. But despite their suffering, the people have not forgotten God or strayed from His ways. They can say that they're observing His covenant. They haven't forgotten Him. They express their trust in God and God's knowledge of their hearts, and they call on Him at the end to intervene and ask for redemption. And the psalm ends with a plea for God to awaken and show His loving kindness to His people. So again, as I said, when suffering comes into our lives, when suffering comes upon us, we have to be ready for it. We have to be prepared. And certainly Korah and the sons of Korah are preparing Israel for the suffering that they're experiencing and may come. And they set an example for Israel, and I think an example for us as well. Suffering is going to come into our life. How do we respond? And here in verse 17, the psalmist responds with renewed commitment. Great example for us. Look what he says. All this has come upon us. Well, the psalmist is definitely not looking at life through rose-colored glasses, right? They're not looking at their situation as if it doesn't really exist, or they can wish it away somehow, or they could just ignore it. Instead, they're facing reality. They're facing the fact they feel rejected and abandoned. And they're like so much livestock that's led to the slaughter. Their neighbors are laughing at them. They're publicly humiliated. They recognize this. And this is on their mind, and they're experiencing this. But nevertheless, he says, but we have not forgotten you. The implication, of course, is that they could have. They could have forgotten God. They could have turned away from Him. They could have turned their back on Him. They could have just turned themselves over to their situation and complained and whined and lamented and said all is lost and God has abandoned us. But they don't. They don't. They say, we have not forgotten you. Despite all they are experiencing, they're not going to turn from the Lord. At this point, He's walked with them for so long and proven His loving kindness to them over and over and over again. So despite what's happening around them, and they're acutely aware of it, they know He will not fail. Even they trust their suffering is doing some good. Look where they go on here. We have not dealt falsely with your covenant. Last stanza in that verse there. We have not dealt falsely with your covenant. I think the covenant he has in mind here is the covenant in Deuteronomy. That second giving of the law, chapter 28. God had promised blessing after blessing after blessing for their obedience to the law, so that they would know beyond their current circumstances that God will not forget them, but will bless them. They know that's going to happen. They're not dealing falsely with the covenant. In other words, as best they can, they're keeping that covenant even while they're in exile, even while they're away, because they are not forgetting God. To not forget God is not just to bring Him to mind and remember that He exists, but to remember His promises and to live by those promises and to stand firm by those promises no matter what's going on around you. It's important to do that, and that's what they're resolving to do. They're saying, remember us, Lord, because we're remembering you. And they have confidence and trust. In terms of application, this is a great example for you and I to follow. You know, suffering is going to be our lot. We're going to suffer greatly or we're going to suffer less, but everybody's going to suffer at some degree. It comes upon us in a moment, and we have in that moment to make a decision. Do we give up or hang on? Do we have faith or do we go to unfaith? We have to make that decision. We have to be ready, and this psalm equips us and it prepares us for making that decision. I'd like you to respond to this psalm today. Let me suggest it to you that you would read Romans 8, 36 to 39 today. Read that psalm and reflect on it. And really, more than reflect, receive the truths of the Romans passage into your own soul today by personalizing these verses. Take verse 37 in Romans 8, for example. Instead of saying, "In all these things we overwhelmingly conquer through him," turn that into a personal prayer and say something like, "In him, or in all things, I overwhelmingly conquer through him." Do this for all these verses and make it your prayer today. Prepare your soul to respond to suffering, whether it's great or little, by redoubling your effort to remember the Lord and to live by faith in his presence. God bless you.